Hi, good evening. My name is Brian Live. I'm the Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty. On behalf of our Board of Directors, our supporters, please allow me to welcome all of you to this evening's virtual Congressional Meet and Greet with Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach from Minnesota. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our organization. The Iranian Americans for Liberty are a bipartisan group of Iranian Americans from all around the nation that are working together to support and strengthen U.S. foreign policy as it relates to Iran, to the Middle East, and also national security solutions that bring democracy, human rights accountability, and freedom of speech to Iranians living under the oppressive Islamic Republic of Iran. Please visit our website at www.ia4l.org to learn a little bit more about our organization. And finally, please be advised that this event is for educational purposes only, and all of our events are free and open to the public. You just have to register in advance to get an invitation to the events. So at this time, it's my pleasure to hand the program over to this evening's moderator, Adele Nazarian. Adele, the floor is yours. Have a good conversation, the two of you.
Thanks, Brian. You're great as always.
My pleasure.
Hello, Congresswoman. Welcome. I would like to welcome all of you tonight. It's so great to see familiar faces in the room audience. Welcome to this evening's virtual Congressional Meet and Greet with Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach. My name is Adele Nazarian, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's event and conversation. Before we get started with our Q&A, I would like to read a short bio about this evening's special guest. Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach is truly a trailblazer and a proven conservative leader with over 20 years of experience in the Minnesota Senate, including 4 as the president of the Senate. Michelle Fischbach, in 1996, was first elected to the Minnesota Senate in a special election by flipping a long-held Democrat seat, a position that she held until 2018. In 2011, she was the first woman in Minnesota history to serve as president of the Minnesota Senate. She also served as chair of the Minnesota Senate Higher Education Committee, and most recently was the 49th Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, ascending to that position following the resignation of her predecessor. Michelle has spent the last 2 decades cultivating strong relationships with the agricultural community and will continue to fight for Minnesota's farm families in Congress. During her time in public service, Michelle has championed many important issues for Minnesota families, workers, and small businesses. She strongly believes in our Second Amendment rights and is a fierce defender of the unborn. Right to life, pro-life. As it relates to foreign policy on Iran, Congresswoman Fischbach is a co-sponsor of Congressman Banks' Maximum Pressure Act, as well as Congressman McClintock's resolution condemning the crimes of the Iranian regime. Congresswoman Fischbach, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We would like to turn it over to you now for some brief opening remarks before we get started with our Q&A.
Well, thank you very much. And I hear you read off my bio, and I just think, wow, I've been busy, but I appreciate all of the kind words, and I am so excited to be here tonight. And thank you so much for the invitation. You mentioned, the foreign policy and the resolutions that I've co-sponsored, and it's incredibly important to me. We're talking about freedom, we're talking about peace, and we're talking about individual rights, and I appreciate that. And that's why I am on those bills and on those resolutions. And I just, like I said, I think we've got so much in common with those themes, and so I appreciate the invitation tonight. And I would love to just get into the questions, and we will have a wonderful discussion tonight. So thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you. So for our first question, we'd like to ask you, what's your why? What's the reason that you wake up every day and continue to be a strong voice for your constituents in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C.?
One of the biggest things is that rural Minnesota is so important to me. We live here. I raised my family here, and it it's a special way of life, and I appreciate it. And we appreciate it in rural Minnesota. We appreciate our freedoms. We appreciate the Constitution. We appreciate those things that the United States does for us. And so I get up every day to make sure that they have a strong voice in Washington, D.C., because that is so important, because so much of the time, rural areas get forgotten. And these are my neighbors and my friends and people that really rely on me to make sure that their voice is heard in Washington, D.C. And it is a humbling experience to be elected by your constituents and given that honor of going to Washington, D.C. for them. So I do get up every morning thinking of ways that I can help them and improve their life.
Awesome. Well, speaking of being a strong voice, you've certainly been a strong voice and leader when it comes to workforce development. Can you please tell our audience a little bit more about the work that you're doing on this front?
Well, workforce development is huge. And I will tell you, when I was the chair of the Higher Ed Senate in Minnesota Senate, we worked very hard to make sure that those 2-year programs and those 4-year colleges were strong so that our students were getting the kind of education that would take them into the future. And I particularly really focused a lot on those 2-year colleges because they are so important, and they're all across the rural United States and particularly rural Minnesota, and want to make sure that our students can get their education at home. So that's the first part of workforce development. But second part is we need people to get jobs. We need people to work. All over my district, there are open jobs, and these are not low-paying jobs. These are good jobs that people can survive on and live in rural Minnesota and have a great way of life. And so we really need to be making sure that we're bringing those people to rural Minnesota. And part of that is having a strong rural community. And so we talk about agriculture, but also part of that is having that strong rural community and having the kind of healthcare, the education that's available. And one of the big things that come across very recently in the pandemic shutdown showed us a lot is the broadband. And so making sure that our rural communities and have those things that they need to attract the kind of workforce that we need. So making sure we have the people, but then we're able to train them too.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. It's so important to have American jobs. So we've seen a lot of that over the past 4 years. Hopefully that will continue with leadership like yours.
Well, and I will just add, and I didn't mean to interrupt, but when we're not just talking about ag jobs, we're talking about manufacturing jobs. We're talking about all kinds of those jobs that are available in rural Minnesota and I'm sure across the nation in those areas. And we just really need to make sure that we have those folks, because we do have jobs. And if you want a job, you can get one here.
Thank you so much. So for our next question, let's dive into your committee assignments. You are on the House Committee on Agriculture, Rules, and Judiciary. Can you please tell your audience a little bit more about what these committees do and how you will use your time on these committees to support your constituents?
Well, the Judiciary Committee really touches on nearly every aspect of American life, from the federal criminal code to the culture war to the drug patent. So there's all kinds of things. As a matter of fact, today we had a hearing in one of the subcommittees on the antitrust issue. And so there's a lot going on in judiciary. And as a matter of fact, the other day we heard a bill regarding or a resolution hearing regarding discrimination against Asian Americans. And, that's a huge issue. And I think there was broad agreement that the problem exists. I think what it comes down to is whether it should be a state or a federal issue and things like that. But the committee also has jurisdiction over the courts. So one of the things that's going to go through that committee is the Democrats' proposal to pack the court. And I will just add as a side note, I will call Congressman Nadler on when he said they were going to unpack the court. President Trump didn't pack the court. President Trump filled the seats that were open with people that were good, solid jurists. And so he did not back the court, and there's no need for the Democrats to unpack it at this point. So I oppose that, but that's going to be something that'll come through that committee. On the Agriculture Committee, it was just, I really, really wanted to be on that committee. I'm excited about that committee. My district is very rural, and I think there's so many things that go through that committee that are so important to rural Minnesota. You know, as we're talking about the farm programs, as we're talking about all of those things that are going through there. And when I talk about my strong rural communities issue, a lot of that is going to depend on that. So, I was also very proud to be named the ranking member of the Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee. And that's where broadband is going to be going through. It has jurisdiction. So very excited to be dealing with that, because that is one of my big issues right now. And finally, the House Rules Committee, it's perhaps the most active committee in the House, because every resolution goes through, or everything goes through before it goes to the floor. So we have a lot of meetings, and we determine how the debate will progress when it goes onto the floor. And I really think it's exciting, because it gives me the opportunity to see and comment on every piece of legislation before it goes to the floor. So, and there's lots going on there, and I enjoy that committee, and do enjoy hearing knowing all that's going on in Congress.
That's wonderful. Everything that you've touched upon is so sorely needed, and it touches every single facet of society, honestly. So thank you. You know, speaking of rules, during the 2020 campaign cycle, law enforcement was such a major issue throughout the country. And can you please tell us a little bit more about your record as it relates to supporting law enforcement?
You know, that is an issue that is very, very important to me. And throughout my time in the Minnesota Senate and now in Congress, I do everything I can to support law enforcement. They have really had a hard time the last few years now. And my son-in-law is a former Minnesota State Trooper. And while I was in the Minnesota Senate, we had a horrible incident in one of the small towns where a police officer was shot and killed in the line of duty. And it struck me to the heart. I knew his family, I knew him, I knew most of the members of that department. And I think that we need to remember the sacrifices that their families are making when they send that individual out to do things in society that we ask them to take care of everything. You know, we call law enforcement for so many things, whether it be people obeying the speed limit or someone being hurt. We call on them to do a lot of things, and so it is so important. And over the years, I've been able to help increase training dollars for them, and making sure that they have solid, good training. And I think that is one of the things that's so important when we're talking about law enforcement, is because they continue, you know, the proposals are to, you know, the Democrats continue to push things forward, like, removing the ability to do certain things while they're engaging with someone who is potentially breaking the law, things like that. But I think what we really need to be doing is increasing that training and making sure, because there's no one that dislikes a bad cop more than the good cops. And the good officers far outnumber those bad officers. And they will weed them out, and we need to weed them out by making sure that they have the kind of training that they need and want, and the kind of equipment that they need. And that's the important part, is making sure that we're supporting them in that way, as opposed to criticizing and continuing to berate them, but making sure that we're lifting them up as they need to be, and as they're keeping us safe, and as they're the one answering those 911 calls.
Absolutely. And you know, it's so interesting, because what you're saying is so accurate. It's unfortunate that a select few oftentimes ruin it for the majority. And the media, of course, has played a role in that. I will add to you something. When I was in, I've traveled to a lot of countries for the work that I've done, and as a journalist, as an international policy analyst. But when I was in Kiev, Ukraine, I did notice how there were Canadian and US law enforcement that were actually training local law enforcement about how to gain the trust of local Ukrainians, because the trust within civil society with the police law enforcement had been so shattered. So you're absolutely correct. We're so fortunate here in America where we do actually have more good cops than bad cops, as opposed to other countries where it's the other way around. There are less of the good cops. So thank you for that. We agree with you that supporting law enforcement is a non-negotiable.
Absolutely. Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about agriculture now. Love that. Minnesota's 7th district is home to more than 30,000 farms spanning 34,000 square miles. We know that you have been a leader in this area, Congresswoman Fischbach, but for our viewers who don't know much about how important the agricultural economy is to our nation, can you please talk a little bit more about this?
Well, the agricultural economy and agriculture is, it's critical to the U.S. It's critical not only domestically, but around the world. And unfortunately, it doesn't always get the attention it deserves. It's animals, it's crops, it touches virtually every other sector of the economy in some way, because we're processing those, we're taking those to market, we are spreading them all over the world. And so we need to, make sure that we are paying attention to that. And, most of these farmers, particularly, in Minnesota, they spent their entire lives building these farms, generation to generation. And it's an important part of the economy, obviously here in the 7th district, but like I said, across the country, because it does touch virtually everything. And I think that so much of the time, that people forget that these people are out there and they are bringing in the crops so that we're all eating, and it's showing up in our supermarkets, and we forget that. And I think that there's sometimes that nostalgic feeling that there's one guy out on his tractor pulling in some crops, but honestly, it has to be a big scale, because we are feeding so many people and we are doing it efficiently and we are doing it well. And I think that farmers sometimes get a bad rap when they're talking about the polluting and all of that, and the climate change and all of that that's going on, where these guys are the first conservationists. They are guys and gals. I use the word guys because that's Minnesotan. We call everybody guys, so don't be offended.
I'm not.
But,
so
no, I kind
no
of
pronouns
figured
here.
but they're out there and they're the first conservationists, because they're not going to go and ruin the land that they have generations invested in, and their money and their time and their livelihood is invested there. They're going to take care of it, and they're going to do what they need to do to make sure that land stays healthy and that they are doing what's right. And they've been doing a lot of the things. They've been proactively moving towards a lot of those conservation practices that are now going to be imposed on them. And that's the last thing they need, is to have those additional costs. But agriculture is just, people don't realize it because they don't see it, especially those folks that live in cities, and they don't see it, but it is important, because that's how their grocery store gets full.
Definitely. And this is a whole different topic, but it's interesting to note that Bill Gates did purchase several, I think, million acres of land. So agriculture certainly is an important part of every single person's life. So thank you for that, for your important attention to it. We have covered some domestic issues so far, so let's switch over to a little bit of foreign policy questions. The Islamic Republic of Iran constantly chants "Death to America" and "Death to Israel." Madbad America, Madbad Israel, the little and the great Satan, as they like to refer to it as. Why do you think the current administration is so eager to loosen economic sanctions on a regime that clearly does not like the United States of America and our allies?
We're seeing President Biden, continue some of the failed policies of the Obama, the former president Obama's policies, and that he used in the Middle East. And Obama really, I think he believed that by treating Iran like a friend, that they would become a friend, and he would be able to influence that way. But unfortunately, this gravely misunderstood their threat to Israel, and the United States, our regional allies and their own people. President Biden wants to continue this kind of, friendship kind of thing where he may appease them in some way, but we can't let bullies treat us the way they are, and that's not going to be the way. That's why I support President Trump's maximum effort, and making sure that we are treating them the way they should be and treating them the way they are treating us. And I don't understand why President Biden has decided to go back when the Trump the way that Trump was handling them was far more successful than the way Obama was handling them.
Yes, sanctions absolutely work, and sanctions being removed, of course, the JCPOA is going to impact not only the Iranian people, it actually directly impacts the people of Syria, Libya, Yemen. So, very, very well. Well, speaking of threats to national security and the people in the region and here in America, many elected officials were highly critical of the previous administration, the Trump administration's decision to order a drone strike that took out and killed former IRGC General Qasem Soleimani. You were not, and you actually praised President Trump for taking decisive action on this. First of all, we of course agree with your statement, and would like you to please tell us, are the Iranian people and the world safer now that Soleimani is gone?
Well, the IRGC is a terrorist group, and they have sponsored countless terrorist attacks against the U.S. and also against Muslims in the Middle East. Soleimani, he was the face of the reign of terror, and he traveled all around the region planning attacks which led to the death of untold numbers of people. And the Iranian regime must be dealt with as you deal with a bully. Like I said earlier, if you kill Americans, we kill you. And you can't travel around the world planning terrorist attacks and sleep comfortably in your bed at night. And I was very proud that President Trump did take decisive action. And unlike Obama and probably Biden, President Trump actually enforced his red line and exacted justice on a terrorist.
Yeah, thank you so much. National security is the top priority, of course. For our next question, let's focus on the current presidential administration. As you might know, world leaders are currently in Vienna having discussions related to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The Iranian regime has stated that they will not entertain any conversations with the Biden administration unless the US removes economic sanctions and re-enters the JCPOA with no conditions placed on the Iranian regime. Well, what do you think about the JCPOA, and should we be negotiating with the Iranian regime?
The Iran nuclear deal was very misguided. And the fundamental flaw is how Obama and Biden have dealt with Iran. And it is a misguided belief that, like I call them bullies, they believe that bullies are just nice people and that they're misunderstood, and they're dead wrong. This is the same way that the Democrats are dealing with rioting in our streets. So it's very typical. They're afraid to use law and order against lawlessness and crime. The Iranian regime, it threatens its neighbors and actively seeks nuclear weapons while its people struggle and its infrastructure crumbles. And President Trump, as I mentioned earlier, dealt with Iran correctly, maximum pressure. And that is why I co-sponsored, like I mentioned earlier, and you mentioned in the introduction that I co-sponsored the Maximum Pressure Act that Congressman Banks has put into place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. It is widely known also that the Islamic Republic of Iran funds terrorism all around the world. Of course, in recent years, the regime provided support, material support, and other to Hamas in Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Assad's regime in Syria, and many, many more terrorists around the world. In Israel, of course, Hamas's, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They are both responsible for numerous deadly attacks originating in Gaza and the West Bank, including attacks against Israeli civilians in the Sinai Peninsula. What can Congress continue to do to freeze the regime's finances that fuel terrorism around the world?
Congress can do what the administration is not doing. If the Biden administration is afraid to confront Iran, then Congress needs to require them to do so. They need to require him to do so. They need to push. The Maximum Pressure Act, like I mentioned, would require those economic sanctions and Iranian regime finances that President Trump imposed. And the bill actually has 89 co-sponsors, and none of them are Democrats, unfortunately. But I think it's clear that the Democrat-controlled Congress is not willing to confront Iran with any level of seriousness, but we will continue to push.
Yeah, very, very admirable. As we discussed, the regime in Iran spends billions, not millions, but billions of dollars funding terrorism around the world. This is an issue that most Iranians, everyday Iranians, do not support, actually. They would rather see those billions of dollars spent on building infrastructure in their country, building schools, building roads. What is your message to the people of Iran that might be listening to this event? We do have viewers in Iran, believe it or not. Do you stand with the Iranian people in their quest for freedom from the tyrannical regime in Iran?
My friend, Congressman Tom McClintock, excuse me, he has the House resolution that you mentioned earlier that I co-sponsored addressing this very issue. And, the House Resolution 118, condemns the atrocities and crimes of the Iranian regime, and then states clearly that we stand with the people of Iran, who live under corrupt and oppressive regime, and we really do need to, if they're listening, we are trying to support you. We are with you. It is it is not the way people should have to live, and I support the right of the Iranian people to peacefully protest.
Yeah, that's the key there. The peaceful protests. Thank you. Let's shift back to your work in the People's House. Members of the squad, like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, have set their sights on one of America's staunchest and strongest allies in the region, Israel. They are widely considered the de facto leaders of the BDS movement in America. Of course, the BDS movement is the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which seeks to delegitimize Israel. Why do you think that Representatives Omar and Tlaib are so critical of the world's only Jewish state, while ignoring the humanitarian violations that happen every week in Iran and all around the world?
I don't want to necessarily speculate on my colleagues' motives, but I will tell you this: I strongly disagree with them. Pretty much on every issue, but this one in particular, I will say. But it is more important now than ever that we continue to support peace in the Middle East, and I think that President Trump was making strides with that. And it's not only but for the Iranian people and for our Jewish friends in the state of Israel. And it's a democracy, and in a region rife with horrible things going on, with bad actors, and they pose no threat to the Muslim nations around them, nor to the people of Iran. And but they merely want to peacefully coexist. And I think that, like I said, that President Trump really made efforts in that direction. And I don't think he gets enough credit for what he did in the Middle East. That was just kind of overlooked by the media. And so we will continue to work for that.
It's interesting. The first victims of the BDS movement, which targets Israel, believe it or not, are usually the people who are Arabs and Muslims, because many of them are employed in Israel, living in Israel very freely. And a lot of surveys taken show that the majority of them who are living in Israel actually would prefer to live there than under the Palestinian Authority. So
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the same thing, how often the first victims of, radical Islamic terrorism are Muslims themselves. So for our last foreign policy question, we would like to ask you for your opinion on this. The United Nations Women's Rights Commission recently placed Iran on this commission, heading Iran to now be on the UN Commission of Women's Rights. In Iran, women are legally considered half of a man and have been oppressed by the ruling class of Iran for decades. What is the United Nations thinking, placing the world's most notorious, arguably, human rights abuser on this commission?
This is the kind of thing that my constituents hate. And frankly, it undermines the UN's legitimacy and credibility. With the entire global community, I think that people see that this is a ridiculous thing to do, and that's why that no matter how much we may want to say that the United Nations can solve the world's problems, they can't. And we have to maintain a strong nation, a strong national unity, and secure our borders, and to make sure that we have a strong military to protect the United States from these threats. And that's what it boils down to. But this is the kind of thing that just makes them look foolish.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have one final question for you, and it's a little bit different than the topics we've discussed, but we think you're going to like it. I'd like to know, please, if you could have dinner with any two deceased individuals, who would they be, and where would this dinner take place?
Okay, so first, and this is kind of, I would want to have dinner with my grandpa, because he passed away the day after my son was born. Never got to meet him. And so what I'd love to do is have him to a big family dinner at my house so that he could see the bedlam it is with my kids and my grandkids. And just to probably just sit there, not talk a lot, just let him soak in the craziness of all those. It would be his great-grandchildren. His great-grandchildren. So, and then the other one would be Mother Teresa. And pretty much anywhere. She would probably not want to go any place too fancy. So, but I would just love to sit with her and absorb the kind of peace that she had.
You're a phenomenal woman, Congresswoman Fischbach.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And so, with that said, we have reached our limit for today's conversation. And I will add that your grandfather, I believe, is watching and has already met your son up above. So on behalf of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, I want to thank you for taking the time to connect with our community. And I'd like to give you the opportunity now to please provide some brief closing remarks before we wrap up. Tell us, please, what is your message to the Iranian American community?
Well, I will just say thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to just talk to you a little bit today. And please remember that, that we share those common bonds of freedom and individual responsibility. And, you mentioned law enforcement, but I think that the freedom and the ability to do what you want to do with your life, and you don't have to live under the kind of regime that is taking place, that is in control right now in Iran, and want to make sure that people understand that there are Americans who share those values, and we will continue to fight and do what we can. And please see us as allies in the fight.
Thank you again, Congressman Fischbach, the Iranian Americans for Liberty. Thank everyone for joining us this evening. Our next virtual event will be held on May 11th with another special guest, Congresswoman Claudia Tenney from New York. Please do visit www.ia4l.org for this event. Until next time, I'm Adele Nazarian. Have a great evening.